welcome to an all-new episode of Josh's Car Corner, the first one in quite a while. So I'm in my new garage and I've got the GTO up on jack stands, and I'm currently in the process of tearing it down so I can get the engine back out of it again so I can fix this oil pressure problem. So over the course of the winter, I'm going to be doing several modifications and upgrades to the GTO. So rather than doing long 20-minute, 30-minute episodes and combining a bunch of things at once, I decided what I'm going to do instead is a series of short videos over the course of the winter, chronicling every upgrade I'm doing to the car as I'm doing it. And they'll be about 5-10 minutes long. So first off is right here, where the battery would normally go. I am going to finally relocate the battery to the trunk. And that's going to be for a couple of reasons. One, batteries tend to last a lot longer when they're not sitting next to a hot engine and hot exhaust headers. Two, weight transfer, and I've talked about this before. Taking weight from the front of the car up high in this corner and moving it to the back in a lower spot and centering it in the car will help the weight balance and overall handling of the car, which is something I want to do for a reason I will explain. And number three, it's going to enable me to put a much bigger battery in the car, which I'm also going to do for weight reasons. And also, because this is now a 12-to-1 compression motor, the stock Group 35 battery with the 700 cold cranking amps, it struggles to start this engine sometimes, and I'm just afraid one day it's going to be hot, and the engine's going to be hot, and it isn't going to get the engine turned over. So I need more cranking amps, I need a bigger battery, and putting it in the trunk will enable me to do that. Second thing is right over here in the corner, and this is something else I've talked about before. I know that in Australia, in the 2006 and 2007 VZ Platform Utes, Holden was running an E38 computer because they were running Gen 4 motors down there. They were running the L98 and a 58X Reluctor version of the LS2 in HSV models. No one's ever tried to do this over in the States, and I know that every experiment needs a guinea pig, so I've decided my car is going to be that guinea pig. I have an E38 computer on the way that has the correct service number and the correct vintage to do this experiment. And I'm also going to be getting an extra engine to play with to test it out that will one day be used in the Crewman. So it isn't going to be a waste. I am going to get an extra engine just for throwing it here in rough testing with the E38, but I have high hopes that it's going to work and I will be able to run this GTO on an E38 computer. And if I can do that, I'll get the crank changed out to a 58X Reluctor on this engine, so this engine runs right, and it will be the first GTO in the US running on an E38 computer. And it opens up a ton of possibilities that I will talk about in a later episode. Another thing I'm going to work on this winter is upgrading this suspension. I have had these BC coilovers in the front of the car for about 8 years, and I think they're finally about tapped out. And I've never had coilovers in the back of the car. I've just had those King zero drop springs with airbags in them for the drag strip. I've never had rear height adjustability, and I finally want it. So I'm going to be upgrading the car to a new Petters coilover setup all the way around, so I will have proper adjustability and control of the suspension, because one of the things that's going to be happening with the GTO is it's going to slowly migrate away from being a street car and a cruiser into more of a weekend track monster. It's still going to have some street ability, so I'm not going to gut the interior completely, but I am going to start upgrading it and making it more oriented toward track duty. And I'm talking about autocross, road course days, track days, gymkhana, still the drag strip, but not oriented specifically toward going to the drag strip. Just parts that will work in concert that will allow me to do both things effectively. The other thing I'm going to be doing over the winter is upgrading the brakes, because now that I'm back in Wisconsin again, I have every intention of going back to Road America and trying to better the time I set there 7 years ago. And the thing that has always failed me and cost me so much time is the factory brakes. They just can't handle the drastic speed changes of Road America, going from 150 miles an hour down to 70, 60 and 1/4, 50 miles an hour to make the next turn. They just overheat, and then the car ends up in the gravel. That happened to me twice. So I am going to be putting bigger brakes on the car, and I'm going to be using a setup you've probably never heard of before, but when I was in Arizona, a gentleman introduced me to a way to do it even better than the kits you can buy right now, because instead of using kits that have brackets that are multiple pieces, they're billet single piece units, to use the big 6-piston brakes in the front and 4-piston brakes in the rear that we all know and love. But I'm going to take it even further than that, because I think I found a way to custom fit really good rotors in the front that are also 2-piece rotors to help keep the weight down. So that's something else I'm going to be working on this winter. One thing I need to mention that I will also be doing in the back of the car is upgrading the fuel pump. When I rebuilt the motor last year, I wanted to go with a bigger pump than the Dietzwerks 65C that I had in there, just because I thought I was going to be getting right on the edge of what it was going to support when running on ethanol. So I went to a DW300, but I had problems with it. It wouldn't work with my factory bucket. I could never make the thing work. It wouldn't build pressure, and I never figured out what was wrong with it. So right now, the car is running on a cheap Chinese pump and bucket that actually hold pressure up until about 6,000 RPM, and then it starts to taper off. So I'm going to be upgrading and using that 8.1 bucket that I was testing last year that I thought I might be able to work, but I'm going to go with a DW400 pump from Dietzwerks too. But when I do that, I'm going to have to run a new power line to run it, because it's going to have such a big amp draw, the factory wiring will no longer support it. It's going to get too hot, the resistance is going to get too high, and it's going to lead to problems. So one of the advantages of also putting the battery back here in the trunk is going to be that it'll be easy to run a new power wire to that fuel pump, which I will also show you how to do, because it's going to involve installing a secondary relay to trigger it and make it work with the factory setup, which is not going to be too difficult, but it'll be helpful to show how that happens in case you ever decide you want to run a bigger fuel pump of your own. I don't think I'm going to go return style with the pump right now, although the 8.1 bucket will allow me to do that. I don't think I'm going to do it at this point in time. I don't think the engine's making enough power to justify it, but I am going to put some sort of pressure gauge on the engine that I'm going to be able to see the fuel pressure from now on. So if it does start to fluctuate, or I do start to have problems with it, I can think about going with a regulator up on the front of the car later on if I decide to, but for the time being, I'm just going to leave it returnless. One other thing I'm going to show you this winter is how to start playing with the cluster. Now, you may have heard of a program called VZ Cluster Mod. You get a special cable that you plug into your laptop, and you plug it into the OBD2 port, and it actually allows you to get into the cluster and start making modifications to change things about it. Like, you can change the startup logo. If you don't want the Pontiac logo, you can get the Holden logo, the HSV logo. If you know how to find it, there's actually a Brazilian Chevrolet logo buried in the cluster. There are also ways you can modify. You can have the shift light come on with a buzzer if you want to have a shift light. You can also modify the coolant gauge so it actually reads properly. Instead of being that dummy gauge that sits in the same place from 160 to 230 degrees before it goes up, you can actually modify it so it reads like a coolant gauge should, and you have a much better idea of what your engine temps are. So that's another thing I'll be messing with over the course of the winter. Now, you might be asking yourself why I'm continuing to make upgrades to the car. Well, for one thing, I've always wanted to find ways to improve the car, and if I'm going to do something, I want to make sure it gets done right. And secondly, I have plans for the car. So like I said, I want to have it transition to more of a weekend track day car. One of the things I am definitely looking to do next year is compete in the Optima Street Car Challenge with this thing. And they run events all over the country, and I want to try to get to at least 3 events next year, because if you get to 3 events, you qualify to compete for the national points score and win in your class. It actually says on the Optima website that competing with your car in the Street Car Challenge is a great way to showcase vendors who make parts to improve and modify street cars. So the idea is to keep it as much of a street car as possible, but to improve it in any way you can without taking away from it being a street car and making it more competitive. So I want to use this as an opportunity to showcase vendors that still make parts for this car. And if I can work out some arrangements with some vendors to supply me with parts so I can get the car upgraded, I would gladly put their names on this car too for when I'm competing at those events. So that's going to do it for this episode. I'm going to keep getting the engine tore out of the car and get it apart and start working on fixing that oil pressure problem. And I will be making episodes as I go along, and every little thing I do on the car this winter, there will be an episode about. So look forward to seeing a bunch of little episodes this winter as I work on it. I'm going to actually start a separate series and a different playlist for it, but it'll also be available on the primary channel as well. So keep looking for updates as they do it. Hopefully, I will be able to make good progress on the car this winter and get all the things done that I want to get done. So thanks for watching this quick episode of Josh's Car Corner. I will be getting new episodes out there very soon.